The desert morning at the remote test strip was supposed to be quiet, the kind of quiet where even the wind forgets to blow. Engineers in khaki uniforms sipped bad coffee, scribbled notes, and prepared for another disappointing trial with a patched-together prototype they all privately believed should have been scrapped months ago. The sun wasn't even over the ridge yet, but heat was already rising off the cracked runway like ghosts. Then the mechanic who had caused all this trouble stepped forward. Frank Mallory, the Kansas dropout, the garage philosopher, the man officially listed as a maintenance technician, but unofficially known across the base as the guy who ruins paperwork, tightened the last bolt on an aircraft nobody wanted to bet on. His hands were steady, rough, stained with oil that could never fully wash off. He wiped them on his trousers, took one long breath, and tapped the side of the strange propeller he had built in secret. The propeller didn't look like it belonged to any airplane of the era. Its blades curled slightly inward, as if trying to fold around the wind. The metal shimmered oddly, layered from mismatched alloys scavenged from scrap bins, tractor parts, and an old cargo door. Every engineer who inspected it gave the same verdict. It'll shake itself apart in 5 seconds. Mallory simply smiled each time and said, "Then let it. If it survives that, it'll survive anything." No one expected the brass to approve the test. But the war was reaching a point where desperation outweighed caution, and whispers about runway shortages and emergency takeoff demands had reached high places. Someone finally signed the paper, probably by accident, and the mechanics rolled the little fighter onto the strip at dawn. Pilots drew straws to decide who would fly it. The loser, Lieutenant Harris, climbed into the cockpit with the resigned look of a man who had written a letter to his mother the night before. He didn't trust the plane. He didn't trust the propeller. But strangely, he trusted Mallory. "If you say it'll hold," Harris muttered, fastening his harness, "I hope to hell you're right." Mallory leaned close and whispered, "When she starts pulling, don't fight her. Let her run." Engineers gathered at a safe distance. They didn't talk. They didn't even breathe. The officer in charge raised a hand, then dropped it. The engine roared. At first, the aircraft shook violently, rattling like something possessed. Engineers winced. A rivet shot off the cowling and skittered across the concrete. The propeller blurred, but instead of tearing itself apart, its scream shifted pitch, climbing higher and cleaner, like metal finding its purpose. The vibration eased. The shaking stopped. And then something happened that none of the men on the ground had ever witnessed. The aircraft lurched forward with a force that left scorch marks on the runway. Not 5 seconds, not 4, 3. 3 seconds from throttle up to liftoff. Harris's fighter shot skyward like it had been kicked by God. A burst of dust trailed behind it as it climbed almost vertically, leaving every engineer on the ground staring upward in stunned silence. A captain whispered, "That's impossible." Another corrected him. "No, that's Mallory." In that moment, in the roar of a 3-second miracle, everyone realized they were watching something decades ahead of its time. Before Mallory's impossible liftoff shook the desert strip awake, the engineers standing there had absolute confidence in one thing. Propellers had limits, and those limits were carved into the laws of physics as surely as stone. They believed a propeller could only spin so fast before cavitation tore chunks from the blades. They believed torque stall would flip a plane on takeoff if thrust exceeded structural tolerance. They believed the drag curve past 300 mph turned every piston fighter into a brick pushing through molasses. And they believed no backyard mechanic could change that. In 1944, the aviation world taught that speed belonged to jets, lift belonged to wings, stability belonged to the frame. But propellers were the one piece of the aircraft you did not experiment with. "Prop engineering is precision," one Air Corps manual declared. "Deviation invites destruction." Instructors drilled into pilots and mechanics alike the sacred doctrine. The propeller is sacred geometry, the result of perfect ratios, exact formulas, pure mathematics. Any hand-built, improvised, or creative propeller, especially one made from scrap metal, was nothing short of suicidal. Mallory never bought that idea. From the moment he touched his first airplane engine, he insisted propellers weren't math first. They were music. Every blade sings to the air, he'd tell the younger mechanics. If you listen close, the air tells you what it wants. It sounded like poetry. It sounded unscientific. And that's exactly why the engineers dismissed him. But what they didn't understand was that Mallory wasn't rejecting physics. He simply read it differently. Where engineers saw limits on paper, he saw possibilities in sound. Where they calculated torque curves, he felt them in his palms. While they measured airflow in controlled tunnels, he studied the ripple of grass in a crosswind and the whistle of a tractor blade cutting at odd angles. The misconception didn't end with him. It defined the entire Air Corps. Pilots believed propellers couldn't offer dramatic improvements without new engines. Commanders believed prop power topped out around the mid-400 mph range. Even test divisions believed pistons were at their end. Jets were the future. Why bother trying to make the old system do the work of a new era? But Mallory understood a truth they didn't. Jets were still experimental, unreliable, fuel-hungry, and prone to flameouts. Prop fighters were the backbone of the war. And if the backbone wasn't strong enough, someone had to strengthen it. While the engineers focused on the engines, Mallory looked instead at the one thing no one was willing to touch, the blade geometry. The myth said propellers had reached their physical limit. He believed they were barely past infancy. That belief put him at odds with every supervisor he ever had. He was written up 3 times for unauthorized modifications, twice for unapproved experimentation, and once for excessive curiosity. And yet his planes were the ones pilots requested. Because every time he illegally adjusted pitch or cleaned up blade edges or recalibrated twist angles by hand, the aircraft climbed faster, ran smoother, and held RPM like a creature with its own heartbeat. So when the engineers on the test line laughed at Mallory's homemade propeller, they weren't mocking the man. They were defending the myth. But the myth was about to die. Because on that runway, in those 3 impossible seconds, Mallory proved that perfection wasn't precise. It was flexible. And when the air finally sang the tune he had built from scrap, the whole world learned the truth he'd known from the beginning. Limits aren't real. They're just numbers waiting to be rewritten. Long before Frank Mallory stunned a row of government engineers with an aircraft that lifted off in 3 seconds, he was just a skinny Kansas farm kid who could fix anything with moving parts. He grew up in a town so small the railroad didn't bother stopping there. His family owned a tractor that should have died in the 1920s, but it kept running into the 1940s for one reason. Frank always found a way. While other kids played baseball, Frank rewired spark plugs using fence staples, rebuilt water pumps with tin cans, and straightened bent harrow blades by heating them in the wood stove and tapping them with a hammer until they felt right. He never needed a blueprint. He didn't even need the original part. "Metal talks," he told his father once. "You just gotta listen." His father thought the boy was half genius, half insane, but he never once corrected him. Teachers didn't understand him. Frank struggled in math class, zoning out when equations didn't match the shapes in his mind. He failed tests that required showing work on paper. Yet he could predict wind shifts by the movement of dust on the road. He could hear when a Model A Ford would stall before it even reached the barn. He once rebuilt a broken gearbox using nothing more than 2 nails, a rasp, and a piece of salvaged farm machinery. When a teacher accused him of cheating because nobody that bad at arithmetic could be that good with machines, Frank replied, "I don't cheat, I just don't think in straight lines." That line ended up in his permanent record: combative attitude toward academic authority. In reality, it was the purest explanation of how his mind worked. By the time World War II began, Frank wanted to enlist as an engineer. He applied to the Army Air Force's technical program with a folder of hand-drawn diagrams, airflow sketches, blade curvature designs, even a few rough concepts for variable pitch props he'd never had the metal to build. The selection board rejected him in 3 minutes. Untrained, uncredentialed, not academically suited. Their final note, potentially creative, but dangerously unconventional. He kept that letter folded in his wallet for the rest of his life. So he entered the service the only way the military would accept him, as a grease-stained wrench-turner in a dusty maintenance bay on the edge of an airfield. While officers walked by him without acknowledgement, pilots noticed something else. Planes he worked on ran smoother, climbed harder, and rarely returned with mechanical complaints. When a pilot asked how he balanced blades so perfectly without a proper jig, Frank shrugged and said, "You balance them like you balance a horse on a fence rail. Feel where it leans and fix it till it doesn't." He was promoted, not through tests or school, but because pilots kept requesting him by name before missions. To most mechanics, a propeller was a precision tool that came pre-designed. To Frank, a propeller was a living thing, a metal wing that could be shaped, curved, coaxed, even persuaded to behave differently depending on how you treated it. He studied how birds turned in crosswinds. He watched how wheat stalks bent when storms approached. He noticed how dust devils spun faster when their bases narrowed. And somewhere in the collision of farm life, improvisation, and intuition, a forbidden idea formed in his mind. What if the perfect propeller didn't come from equations, but from everything engineers had chosen to ignore? That question, born in the quiet fields of Kansas, would eventually build the impossible propeller that the world witnessed roaring to life on that desert strip. Before Frank Mallory ever touched the prototype, the world of propeller science in Wauwautu was stuck in a strange crossroads, advanced enough to measure everything, but too rigid to question anything. Engineers knew how to calculate thrust, drag, and pitch. They had wind tunnels, slide rules, and test rigs. But all of it operated inside a narrow box of assumptions that nobody dared to step outside. Propellers had to follow rules, or so they believed. By 1942, the limits were obvious. Fighter engines kept getting stronger, but propeller designs weren't keeping up. Every new horsepower squeezed from a V12 or radial engine hit the same wall. The tips of the blades were starting to approach the speed of sound. At around Mach 0.85, the airflow turned chaotic. Propellers shook, engines overheated, and climb rates collapsed. Engineers called it compressibility stall. Pilots called it the moment the plane tries to kill you. The problem wasn't just speed. It was stability. Under heavy throttle, high-altitude fighters struggled with torque so intense that pilots risked rolling uncontrollably to one side. German tests on the Me-109 showed that past a certain power level, the aircraft simply couldn't remain stable without major design sacrifices. American engineers reached the same conclusion. If you wanted more power, you needed a bigger propeller. And if you made it bigger, the tips would go supersonic even sooner. It was a loop that trapped every designer of the era. Factories tried fixes. They experimented with new materials, reshaped blade tips, and played with variable pitch hubs. Nothing worked for long. A handful of daring tests ended in catastrophic failures. Blades snapping mid-flight, engines ripping themselves off mounts, pilots bailing out with seconds to spare. The Air Forces issued strict guidelines limiting blade curvature, twist tolerance, and maximum pitch adjustment. Anything outside that narrow range was automatically labeled unsafe, experimental, or outright banned. That was the environment Frank walked into, a world where creativity was allowed only if it fit inside the rulebook. Every Bay chief repeated the same mantra. Prop pitch is sacred. You touch it wrong, you kill a pilot. Even senior mechanics wouldn't dare file or bend a blade without written authorization from engineering command. The entire system valued precision, documentation, conformity. It was everything Frank had never been. The irony was brutal. American aircraft engines were improving so rapidly that they were outgrowing their own propellers. P-47s, P-51s, and experimental prototypes all had one problem in common. They were capable of far more power than their propellers could safely convert into forward motion. The bottleneck wasn't fuel, metallurgy, coolant design, or even aerodynamics. It was the rotating piece of metal at the front of the aircraft. The small, seemingly simple system that made every ounce of power usable or wasted. As engineers wrote thicker manuals to explain what couldn't be done, Frank Mallory saw something different, a gap in the logic, a missing variable, a blind spot so obvious he couldn't understand how nobody else saw it. If the blade tips were the problem, why was everyone trying to fix the tips? Why wasn't anyone experimenting with what happened at the center, where the propeller drew strength, direction, and stability? Why didn't anyone consider that maybe the shape of the blade didn't matter as much as the stress pattern the engine fed into it? Frank didn't know the equations, but he knew machinery. And he could feel, in his bones, that every engineer in the room was solving the wrong part of the equation, and that was the crack he was about to drive a bulldozer through. Frank waited until the hangar was empty. Not quiet, not calm, just empty enough that nobody would stop him. The prototype P-51 sat alone under dim yellow lamps, its polished spinner reflecting the dust in the air. It wasn't officially a Mustang yet, just a test airframe, the kind engineers used to try things they didn't want on the record. To Frank, that made it perfect. He climbed onto the maintenance stand, grabbed the propeller by one blade, and gave it a slow turn. Metal groaned. The bearings clicked. It felt tight, strained, like the engine was fighting itself before it even ran. Too damn much torque for one hub, he muttered. And with that one instinctive judgment, he broke the first rule of wartime aviation engineering: never adjust a prototype outside the documented limits. Frank loosened the main collar bolts, twisted the inner blade root by a degree no manual allowed, and then, the truly insane part, he added a narrow shim of scrap alloy behind the base, altering the entire stress pattern of the blade. Any real engineer would call it sabotage. One wrong angle, and the propeller would either tear the nose off or shear one blade at full RPM, sending the pilot into a fatal flat spin before he could even react. But Frank wasn't guessing. He was feeling the metal, like a blacksmith judging the balance of a hammer. His hands had built tractors, fixed mining equipment, repaired broken heavy machinery whose manuals were long gone. He knew what parts wanted to do when forces pulled at them. And when he tightened the bolts again, he felt something click. A new line of tension running perfectly through the blade, into the hub, down the crankshaft. He whispered, "That's better," even though the change was so subtle most mechanics wouldn't have noticed anything different. The next morning, the pilot assigned to the airframe, Lieutenant Harris, nearly fainted when he saw the modification. "Mallory, what the hell did you do? That's illegal. That's a weapons court offense." Frank shrugged. "Fixed the part that was wrong." "You twisted the root," Harris hissed. "That's how you get killed. That's how you get me killed." But test flights had already been delayed 3 times. Command wanted data. The weather was perfect. So Harris, still cursing under his breath, climbed into the cockpit. The ground crew stood twice as far back as usual. One sergeant even muttered, "If that thing goes, we'll hear the pilot scream before the boom." The engine roared to life. Then Frank heard it. A sound no one else recognized. Not vibration, not stress. A smoothness. A flow. Like the propeller was cutting a cleaner path through the air instead of punching it. Harris taxied forward, lifted off the runway, and for a few seconds everything looked normal. Too normal. Frank expected something. Extra torque, a stall, a shudder. Instead, the P-51 prototype climbed faster than any baseline test had predicted. At 5,000 feet, Harris radioed down, "Mallory, what the hell did you do to my plane?" Frank grinned. "Why? Something wrong?" "Wrong? This thing's climbing like it's angry. I barely touched the throttle." Frank didn't answer. He didn't dare. If this worked, he had rewritten physics with a shim of scrap metal. If it failed, the next sound he'd hear would be the explosion of a disintegrating propeller. At 12,000 feet, Harris pushed the throttle forward, and the plane didn't torque roll, didn't shake, didn't choke. It accelerated. The impossible had begun. At 15,000 feet, Lieutenant Harris leveled off for the standard test step. Stabilize the aircraft, trim it, then increase throttle in small increments to check for torque swing, asymmetric drag, or wobble in the prop arc. Every pilot expected a little fight from a prototype. That was normal. But today, the Mustang didn't fight. It streamed. Harris eased the throttle forward. Just a half inch. That was all. The P-51 should have leaned hard left from torque, the nose pulling like a stubborn animal. Instead, the aircraft stayed perfectly level, like something was countering the spin long before his rudder inputs caught up. "Mallory, this isn't normal," he muttered into the mic. Back on the ground, Frank leaned in, headset pressed tight against his ear. He heard the engine note rising, sharpening. Not the rough growl of a Merlin at full load. No, this was a higher, cleaner pitch. It sounded like the propeller blades weren't biting into the air as much as slicing through it. At 200 knots, the P-51 prototype was supposed to meet its first resistance curve, a slight wall where drag surged. Instead, the airframe surged through that wall with a push that made Harris grip the stick harder. The altimeter spun upward. The slip indicator barely moved. "What the hell?" Harris whispered. "I didn't even push it." For the first time in hours, Frank's pulse spiked. He knew what that meant. His adjustment wasn't just reducing drag. It was changing how the airflow loaded the engine. His twisted root and scrap metal shim had altered the pressure zone at the prop tip, locking the blades into a more efficient bite pattern. It was the aerodynamic equivalent of tuning a bowstring. This wasn't a prop plane climbing on horsepower. It was a prop plane behaving like something that didn't belong in 1944. At 20,000 feet, Harris pulled into a shallow climb. The Mustang didn't slow. It accelerated. The sky darkened around him, the ground shrinking into a mosaic of fields and roads. "Mallory," Harris said again, voice strangely quiet. "This thing's acting like a different aircraft." Frank didn't reply. He was staring at the data officer's clipboard. Manifold pressure stable, RPM smooth, temps normal. Every number exactly where it should be, except for the climb rate. The climb rate was impossible. Harris pushed higher. Past 22,000 feet, past 24,000. This was turbo-supercharger territory, where the real fighting happened against high-altitude German interceptors, where power usually dropped like a stone. Not today. At 26,000 feet, Harris nudged the throttle. The P-51 lunged forward. No hesitation, no choke, just pure acceleration, a clean thrust curve straight out of a physics lecture that didn't exist yet. The test officer beside Frank whispered, "That can't be right. That's jet performance." Harris began laughing over the radio. Not a casual laugh, but a disbelieving, breathless one. "Mallory, you idiot. This thing is climbing like a damn rocket." Then came the call that froze the entire hangar. "I'm at 28,000 feet and still accelerating. This isn't a prop plane anymore. What did you do?" Frank closed his eyes. He knew exactly what he'd done. He had created a propeller that behaved like an early-stage compressor, a hybrid of aerodynamics and brute mechanical instinct. A blade that turned engine torque into smooth, relentless thrust. He had taken a Mustang and pushed it into the performance envelope of a jet. Major Collins was the first through the hangar door. Tall, sunburned, jaw clenched so tight it looked welded shut. He'd been flying fighters since before Pearl Harbor. Nothing rattled him. But today, he marched straight toward Frank like he was storming a machine gun nest. Behind him came two more test pilots, still in flight suits, goggles pushed onto their foreheads, oxygen masks dangling. They didn't walk. They broke formation and rushed the mechanic who had just flipped the laws of aircraft design upside down. Frank didn't flinch. He just wiped his hands on a rag soaked with oil and metal dust. Collins slammed his helmet down on the workbench. It bounced, rolled, and clattered onto the concrete. "Mallory," he barked, "what the hell is in that engine?" Frank didn't answer right away. He looked at the pilots, 3 men who weren't just test flyers but the top airmen in the entire development division. Men who had flown Mustangs long enough to feel every vibration through their bones. Men who knew that what Harris had pulled off in the sky today was beyond any standard blueprint. Captain Riggs stepped forward next. "That climb," he said, breathing hard, "that wasn't horsepower. That wasn't aerodynamics. That wasn't even Merlin behavior." His eyes narrowed. "That was something else. And we want to know what." Frank tossed the rag aside and leaned his elbows on the bench. "It's nothing illegal," he said slowly. "Just adjustments." Riggs scoffed. "Adjustments? Adjustments don't give a prop plane the acceleration curve of a prototype jet." Major Collins jabbed a finger toward the ceiling. 28,000 feet with power to spare, Mallory. Harris was still climbing when we ordered him down." He leaned closer. "That shouldn't be possible. Not with the laws of airflow we know." Frank shrugged. "Maybe the airflow doesn't know the laws." The pilot stared at him. Silence ripped through the hangar, thick and stunned. Collins finally exhaled, shaking his head. "Mallory, we've flown every Mustang variant since the first batch rolled off the line. Nothing climbs like that bird did today." Harris himself entered next, still pulling off his gloves. His face was pale and flushed at the same time, the look of a man who'd just touched the edge of something dangerous and exhilarating. He walked straight to Frank. And then he said the line that made every mechanic in the hangar look up. "What did you do to my airplane?" Frank wiped his hands again. "I tuned the airflow," he said. "Made the prop more efficient at altitude. Tightened the rotational response. Rebalanced the torque load." The pilots exchanged glances. They knew just enough to realize he was downplaying something big. Riggs folded his arms. "Mallory, that wasn't a tune, that was a transformation." Harris nodded. "My Mustang didn't feel like a prop plane. It felt like it wanted to leave the war behind entirely." Collins slammed his hand on the bench again. "Tell us how you did it." Frank took a breath, steady and measured. The breath of a man who knew the truth wasn't just controversial, but classified by nature, even if unofficially. "It's not one thing," he finally said. "It's a combination, alignment, airflow, a blade angle no one approved, a stabilizer tweak I wasn't supposed to try, and one more thing." Everyone leaned in. "What thing?" Collins asked quietly. Frank tapped the side of his skull. "Understanding the engine better than the engineers who built it." Harris grinned, slowly. "Mallory, you didn't fix that Mustang." He stepped back, awe mixing with disbelief. "You evolved it." For 3 days, nothing happened. No officers stormed the hangar. No reprimands. No engineers demanding diagrams. The base moved like normal. Engines warming at dawn. Briefings echoing through tin-walled rooms. Test pilots swaggering across runways like gunslingers. But Frank felt the pressure building the way a mechanic senses a failing bearing. Not loud, not visible, just inevitable. The silence broke on the 4th morning. A courier jeep rolled up beside the hangar, dust swirling around its tires. 2 MPs stepped out, not angry, not aggressive, but stiff enough to make every wrench in the hangar pause mid-turn. "Frank Mallory," one MP said. Frank stood. "That's me. You're to report to Engineering Command immediately." Mechanics exchanged looks. The pilots, who had just returned from a test run, froze. Harris pulled off his helmet, jaw tight. Everyone knew what this meant. Frank wiped his hands, nodded, and followed the MPs across base. Inside Engineering Command, the air felt colder, cleaner, more dangerous. Colonel Warren, chief of aircraft development, sat behind a steel desk flanked by two military engineers. Warren didn't look up as Frank entered. He just tapped a folder on the desk, a thick folder. "Mallory," he said finally, "do you know what this is?" Frank stayed silent. Warren opened the file, and out slid photographs, altitude charts, fuel flow graphs, climb rate measurements, engine temperature logs, and a handwritten pilot testimonial signed by Harris himself. "This," Warren said, "is the report from your little experiment." Frank didn't blink. Warren leaned back. "You took an authorized P-51 Mustang and modified it in ways not documented, approved, or even legal under Army Air Force's maintenance regulations," one engineer chimed in. "You altered the prop angle. You changed the torque balance. You modified the cowling airflow. You bypassed standard engine governor tolerances. And your fuel calibration," he slammed a paper down, "isn't in any manual we've ever printed." Frank simply replied, "It worked." "That's not the point," Warren snapped. "You took an aircraft valued at $35,000 and risked it, and the pilot, on unauthorized changes while America's depending on these planes to win the war." The engineer leaned forward. "Your modifications contradicted the physics models our entire fighter design program is based on." Frank finally spoke. "Maybe your models are wrong." Warren's face darkened. "Mallory, do you understand we could court-martial you for this?" Frank met his eyes, steady, unflinching. "Sir, with respect, you shouldn't be asking how to punish me." He stepped closer, planting both hands on the desk. "You should be asking how a single mechanic made a plane climb higher, faster, and smoother than anything you've designed in 5 years. Silence. Thick. Electric. One engineer swallowed. "We ran the numbers 3 times. Harris's climb profile looks like a jet, not a prop." Warren opened another folder. A transfer order. Frank's stomach tightened. Not fear. Anger. "You're reassigning me?" Warren exhaled. "I'm assigning you to a review board. They want your engine torn down, inspected, documented. Your work will be evaluated." Frank stepped back. "You're grounding the plane?" "Effective immediately." Engineers looked away, ashamed or afraid. It was hard to tell. Frank turned to leave. Then Warren added quietly, "You should know. There's pressure from right field. And Washington. They're wondering how one mechanic outperformed their entire research division." Frank paused at the door. "That's easy," he said without turning around. "I'm not trying to protect a theory. I'm trying to win a war." He walked out, unsure whether he'd just saved the future of American aviation or ended his own career. Frank didn't sleep that night. Not because he feared punishment. He'd made peace with that the moment he twisted the first bolt out of regulation. What tore at him was the thought of those engineers, bright men, educated men, tearing apart his engine without understanding why it worked, without feeling the vibration, without smelling the fuel mix, without listening to the whisper of the prop tip slicing the air clean. Machines only spoke to people who knew how to listen. At dawn, a runner burst into the enlisted barracks. "Mallory, Engineering Command wants you in Test Bay 2, now." Frank threw on his jacket and went. Test Bay 2 looked like a surgical theater built for giants. White floodlights, concrete echoing every footstep. A stripped P-51 engine bolted to a dyno mount. Behind it, 4 engineers stood with notebooks. A 5th, a civilian in a tweed coat, had clearly flown in from Washington. Frank scanned the room. No pilots, no mechanics, only men who lived in blueprints. Warren nodded at him. Not warmly, but not coldly either. "Mallory, your modifications have been reconstructed." Frank raised an eyebrow. "By who?" The civilian answered. By us? Using the parts list we found on your bench. Frank almost laughed. That wasn't a parts list, that was a grocery note. Warren stepped aside. We want you to watch. An engineer pulled a lever. The engine coughed once, then roared to life. Deeper, angrier, more predatory than the standard Packard Merlin ever sounded stock. Even the civilian flinched at the vibration cracking through the air. The engineers checked their gauges. Then one frowned. Torque balance is stable. Why is it stable? It shouldn't be stable. Another looked at the exhaust temperature readings. Cooler than baseline, that's not possible. The third engineer ran a finger down the fuel flow chart, his hand shaking. This curve is wrong. It doesn't match the model at all. Frank stepped closer. Your models assume the air hits the intake in a perfect stream. Engineer number 3 blinked. It does, Frank smiled thinly. Not when you're fighting for your life at 25,000 feet and the sky is punching holes in your airplane. The civilian finally spoke. Run the climb simulation. Engineer number 1 adjusted the dial. The dyno engaged the simulated load. Atmospheric pressure drop, torque resistance, prop load scaling. The numbers shot upward. Harris's original climb performance, the one that had started all this trouble, appeared on the projector. Then the dyno began generating a new line beside it. Higher, steeper, cleaner. Engineer number 2 whispered, This isn't a mod. It's a redesign. Warren turned to Frank. Explain it. Frank wiped grease from a bolt on the workbench and held it up. You designed this engine to run by the book. I designed it to run like a living thing. Engines don't want perfection. They want balance. They want room to breathe. They want forgiveness when airflow gets ugly. He pointed to the readout. That curve is what happens when you give the machine what it really wants, not what you think it should want. The civilian straightened his glasses, voice tight. Mallory, this could change the Mustang's entire combat performance envelope. Frank crossed his arms. That's why I built it. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Warren said quietly, Mallory, I'm lifting your restriction. Effective immediately. You're returning to flight line duty. Frank blinked. What about the MOD? We're sending it to right field, Warren said. Top priority. They want test flights, data, projections. They want everything. Engineer number 1 added, and they want you. Frank frowned. As what? As the lead mechanic on the project. The civilian extended his hand. Congratulations, Mallory. You've just rewritten the future of American fighter design. Frank shook it, but his heart stayed on the airfield where one P-51 sat grounded, waiting to fly again. The Mustang sat on the apron like a predator waiting to be unchained. It wasn't the same airplane Frank had spent nights wrenching on. Not anymore. Engineers had cleaned it, measured it, standardized it, sanitized it. His rough welds had been replaced with polished brackets. His hand-bent fuel lines were now precision-matched. His improvised airflow shims were reproduced in aircraft-grade alloy. But the soul of the machine, his soul, was still inside it. And today, the sky would judge it. Captain Harris climbed the ladder with a grin sharp enough to cut steel. Heard they gave you your wings back, Frank. Frank snorted. They gave me paperwork. Haven't given me your damn airplane yet. Harris patted the fuselage. Well, she's ready. Let's see if your witchcraft holds up when someone's shooting back. A klaxon wailed across the base. Scramble order. Not for a test flight, for combat. A German reconnaissance jet, and Me-262 Scout variant, had been sighted near the coast. High altitude, fast and bold. The kind of mission where American fighters usually arrive just in time to watch the contrail vanish. Harris pulled on his gloves. She's mine today, Frank. Frank nodded, but his stomach twisted. This wasn't a dyno. This wasn't simulation. This was the real sky. Cold, thin, unforgiving. If the mod failed, Harris wouldn't limp home. He'd fall out of the clouds like broken metal. The P-51 barked awake, engines snarling with a depth no factory tune ever matched. Even among the lineup of Mustangs warming their props, Harris's bird sounded different, hungrier, more alive. Frank stepped back as the plane rolled away, his hand resting on the warm metal of the wingtips. "Come back to me," he whispered. "Both of you." 30 minutes later, at 28,000 feet, the radio cracked with static. Then Harris's voice came in, steady, clipped, professional. "Control, this is Eagle 3. Visual contact. Me 262 at high 1 o'clock. He's climbing. I'm climbing after him." Frank froze. Climbing after a jet was suicide. Every pilot knew it. Jets walked away from prop fighters like wolves leaving dogs behind. But Harris wasn't behind. He was gaining. Ground control's voice cracked. "Eagle 3, impossible. Repeat, impossible." Harris laughed, the sharp, disbelieving laugh of a man witnessing physics bend. "Not impossible. I'm holding rate. Engine temp steady. Climbs clean. Mallory's witchcraft is paying off." Frank's heart hammered. Then the German pilot realized he was being chased, caught, and panic broke his pattern. The Me-262 banked hard, bleeding speed. Harris's Mustang stayed glued to the turn. "Control, I'm in guns range, taking the shot." A burst of static, a crack, a shout, then, "Splash 1 jet. Repeat, jet down. The 262 is down." Cheers erupted across the command post. Men ran into the hangars shouting. Mechanics climbed onto engine crates. Officers ripped off their headsets. But Frank just stood there, trembling, not with fear, with pride. His machine, his invention, his outlaw mod, had just rewritten the rules of the air war. Harris landed 20 minutes later, sprinting across the tarmac toward him. "You did it, Frank! You son of a... You actually did it!" Frank only smiled, resting a hand on the cooling cowling. "No," he said quietly. "We did." Above them, the Mustang's prop slowed to a stop, the last blade pointing skyward like a salute. And from that day forward, every pilot on base whispered the same thing. "Give me a Mallory build, and the sky belongs to me."